This is the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this week? Happy Easter.
As per usual, Gary, I am absolutely phenomenal. And it is, as we were discussing moments ago, it is the Feast of Ishtar today, which is great. And this will obviously be out tomorrow. So I hope everyone had, fuckload of eggs, fuckload of chocolate, and they're just happy, ready to go, ready to attack the rest of the year and fucking dominate.
Yeah, personally, I think Easter eggs are a bit overrated. So what I do is I like the way that the chocolate in Easter eggs is thinner than it normally would be in a bar. So that means it's really easy to chop up nice and small. So I put it in my porridge because I'm a big fan of chocolate in my porridge. So that was my Easter celebration this morning.
I'm actually not really a fan of chocolate overall. I know it's fucking blasphemy, but I'm like,
that is awful.
I'd rather just some fucking barbecued meat.
I would agree with that, to be fair. Yeah, I would be more of a kind of a meat and burgers and, like you say, ribs, steak, etc. fan.
But savory beats sweet every fucking day of the week. I don't care. Like, don't at me. Don't fucking come for me. Like, you're wrong if you think sweet is better than savory.
I would agree. I'm a big fan of jellies, but other than that, I would agree savories.
Berries now. Big fan of berries. They're sweet. Fucking delicious. Anyway, look, we're not here to talk fucking shit. We're here to talk about training considerations for the obese individual. Am I right, Gary?
Yes, that's exactly it.
Right. So, excuse me, nearly got sick in my mouth there. Anyway, so training obviously is we've been doing this obesity series and we've talked through a lot of we'll call them causes, a lot of the things that go on with obesity, or we'll call it adjacent to obesity, some of the issues, some of the problems, all that stuff, right? So we've obviously done this entire series, right? So if you haven't listened to it from the start, I would definitely recommend, but I would recommend that because we recorded it. We spent the time recording it. But I would definitely recommend going back and listening to that because it provides the context for the next few episodes that we're going to discuss. And I simply am not going to cover all of the same stuff that we covered in that, because this is always happens with these conversations when you talk about an intervention, say, everyone's like, oh, but what about this? Like someone will mention like socioeconomics, for example. And it's like, we did like 2-3 episodes on that. I'm not going to caveat everything we say here with all of the information we discussed in that, right? So if you haven't listened to the series and you're like, they didn't cover this, minute thing that I think is really important, it's probably covered somewhere else in the series, right? So with that out of the way, we're going to talk about training. We're going to talk about the training considerations for an obese individual, because I'm very aware that a lot of like personal trainers, coaches, health professionals, whatever, they listen to this podcast, and I would like to think that we put out good information. But obviously this is just a launching point. Like, we're simply not going to cover every single nuance of training the obese individual. Like, there's entire courses for that. There's entire books written on it, papers, everything. Like, we're just going to cover some of the things that we think is important, right? So with all of that caveat out of the way, training is obviously an important consideration for the obese individual from a number of perspectives, namely that it helps with weight management. And I'm not even saying like weight loss, like that might be the eventual goal. Again, maybe we're talking about like a 10% reduction for the individual just so they can improve their blood lipids or, whatever it is. However, even if it is a case of just wanting to maintain your weight, just wanting to become healthier, like, training is a really phenomenal tool in a multitude of regards, right? And some of the things that are really important for the obese individual, and I'm talking regardless of the actual training that is implemented, like, it's pretty much universally beneficial. Now, there's definitely some caveats to that, and there's definitely some better protocols than others. However, pretty much universally across the board, I would recommend most people engaging in some form of training, as a general rule, but especially as an obese individual. And then there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, it allows for, we'll call it, better blood sugar control, right? And that's obviously something that, again, we've talked about. There's a diabetes risk. There's, risks associated with that. And if we can like attenuate these risks to some regard, or to some extent with some training, like that's obviously going to be beneficial. As well as that, you get improvements in blood lipids, again, because you're providing somewhat of a sink for, what am I trying to say, Gary? A sink for stuff in the blood, because you're exercising, you're using your muscles, you're increasing your insulin sensitivity, etc. Like things just kind of move better in your actual bloodstream, in your actual like metabolism overall, right? And that has a knock-on effect of improving your heart disease risk, right? And that obviously is important from the perspective of not wanting to die. That's pretty beneficial. And there are also some considerations around that in terms of like what training you do. You're going to get different effects in terms of your reduced like cardiovascular risk. However, again, I just come back to it. I was like, I would like to see you doing some sort of training. You're going to get some sort of risk reduction. You're going to get some return on investment from doing something, rather than going, oh, well, I don't have access to this best training modality or this whatever. I'm like, literally, I don't care if you were in your room fucking walking on the spot. I would rather see that than doing nothing, then also on top of that, like you get improvements in your ability to actually functionally engage with the world, right? And what I mean by that is like, if you are an individual that is overweight, like you can be somewhat closed off from the world because you're not actually able to interact with the world, because walking outside of your house might be an actual ordeal for you because you're not fit enough to do that. And as you can imagine, that's not an ideal way to live your life. That's not ideal, that you're not actually able to engage with the world because you're not actually able to move within the world, right? So that is an important consideration to have. And there's a number of aspects to that as well, just from like a health perspective. Like forget about like actually wanting to live in the world. Like strength is a pretty good predictor of health overall, and like we'll call it longevity. So that is something that we obviously want to improve. And then along with that, we want to improve muscle mass, because again, that is something that is relevant, especially as we age. Like we want to make sure that we have a bank of muscle mass, we'll say, right? And then like this is intuitive enough, but it also helps with controlling weight or improving body composition, and depending on how you actually want to go with that. Again, like it doesn't actually have to be weight loss as the actual goal, even though again, like that can be really beneficial for improving a number of things. And it's hard in the research to be like, oh, this is the improvement you get from this exercise intervention, versus the fact that it's like, oh, well, they also lost weight. It's like that is something that is often entangled in between the two, and it's hard to tell like, oh, this is why they got the benefit of, like, what was the actual benefit of the exercise intervention versus the actual like fat loss that occurred as a result of that intervention. But there's some nuance around that anyway, right? But on top of just improving body composition, you do also get an improvement of where that body fat is actually situated, in terms of like we've talked about previously, in terms of like ectopic fat distribution, like ectopic fat like adipose tissue, and also like visceral adipose tissue. Like that is something that can be improved by just exercise alone. Now the magnitude of effect of that, I'm unsure of. I don't know exactly like, oh, this is going to be the make or break stuff. However, it does seem to be well supported that does occur, which we can hypothesize that is a pretty beneficial thing to occur. Again, if you're unsure of what I mean by that, again, go back and listen to the previous episode we did talking about like what is body fat storage patterns, etc., like that, right? So before we move on, Gary, is there anything else that's just popping to your mind right now in terms of why an individual that is obese should train, in terms of like, okay, we've got all those things, is there anything else that you're kind of like, oh, well, don't forget this?
Yeah, so obviously the benefits of exercise don't necessarily need to be repeated, in that you all hopefully know at this point that exercise is useful, okay, for your health. I even think you can argue that exercise has moral value, and that argument even goes back as far as Plato and Aristotle. If you look at the way that ancient philosophers actually discuss exercise and moving the body, they kind of tied it with morality, but we won't go there for today. But what I will say is that all of the usual benefits of exercise apply in the case of obesity, but there are some additional benefits that I think are important to discuss in the context of obesity. And there's one example would be purely looking at, like you mentioned, weight management previously. And I think we can move that over to body composition, even, that we're not just focused on weight loss here, we're focused on the composition of the obese state. So for example, if your BMI is 35 or 40, let's say, that doesn't necessarily inform us as to how much of that is composed of muscle versus fat. And in the case of obesity, if you are engaging in resistance training, for example, you are going to be strengthening your muscles and your bones and improving your body composition in such a way that it's going to confer a longevity and a health benefit that wouldn't otherwise be the case if the same BMI was composed primarily of body fat. Okay, so that's really important, because if we zoom back to the podcast that we recorded with Richie Kerwin a few months ago, as part of this obesity series, one of the things that we discussed was the obesity paradox, so-called. And the way that we discussed that was that, you know, there does seem to be, in some cases, a longevity benefit in obesity in some specific health contexts that is effectively an artifact of using BMI. So for example, if we're just looking at BMI and we're not actually looking at the composition of muscle mass, we're not actually capturing the full picture. And what seems to be the case is that when people with obesity have higher levels of muscle mass, they're in a healthier state and they have more of a benefit to resist the inevitable decline in function and health with age. So you have to look at that regardless of whether or not you want to lose weight, because I think this is one of the really important things that needs to be emphasized in this discussion, is that exercise in the context of obesity almost always gets reduced to a discussion of weight loss. Okay, and realistically, like, it can play a role in weight loss, but the vast majority of the benefits of exercise actually don't have to do specifically with fat loss. It's more so to do with the improvements in things like the complications of obesity. So we've discussed hypertension as being one of the primary issues with obesity, and we know that exercise is a very potent antihypertensive agent. We also know that exercise has an anti-hyperglycemic effect. So it's going to reduce blood glucose, like you said, having more muscle mass, having better insulin sensitivity. All of these things are beneficial for the obese physiology, if you will. And as you said, we've discussed ectopic fat deposition and we've discussed fatty liver, for example, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is something that's becoming more and more prevalent throughout the world, basically as a result of the transition towards more obese populations. Like prior to the last few decades, viral hepatitis would have been the primary cause of liver transplant, but increasingly now, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is actually becoming more of a problem. And this is fundamentally the result of an energy surplus and obesity. And what we see in the research with exercise, which is really interesting, is that there's a dose-response relationship. As you do more exercise, you get more of this benefit in terms of reducing the amount of fat that's stored in your liver. So you're literally reducing a disease process that is causing significant morbidity and mortality in the population. So this applies to basically every system in the body. You know, exercise is always beneficial. So hopefully we can give you some actual practical takeaways in this conversation, not just for people themselves, but also for trainers, because I think that's really important, is how trainers actually approach this problem too.
Yeah, and like the way I look at it, I'm like, we have like interventions, like pharmacological interventions that help with obesity, and like we'll do a podcast on that. Well, maybe, but we'll talk about that in the future anyway, right? But like, you actually cannot bottle, like you can't put it in pill form or injectable form or whatever, all of the benefits that exercise gives you, right? Like, even just look at it from a purely like we'll call it insulin sensitizing effect. Like, even if you take like the fucking ridiculous doses of whatever insulin sensitizing agents you want, or whatever, you know, in that pathways, pharmacological interventions, like, you still don't actually get all of the benefits that exercise offers in that context. Like, you don't get the same like glycogen depletion that you get from exercise, and as a result of that, like, you don't actually get as much, we'll call it like fat burning, actual like fat oxidation, and it's just like, there's no reason not to exercise. It's like, this is like, the first line intervention. This is like, all right, this gets everything that we're looking at, pretty much. It's like, this you don't have to take a like polypharmacy, you don't have to take 20 different drugs. You just go, okay, you just have to exercise, right? Now obviously that's easy to say, it's hard in practice. Like if you are an individual that has never exercised in your life, or very potentially have had negative interactions with exercise in the past, like if you grew up obese, like you probably didn't like your physical education classes, you probably didn't enjoy that stuff. And then as you get away from like mandatory physical education in schools, even though like obviously it's not necessarily mandatory, like you can kind of opt out, like as we get away from that, like people can just never exercise in their life. Like the most exercise they do is just walking, and even that they're not even getting like I don't know, 5,000 steps per day. It's literally just like walk to the car, sit in the car, and like that's it, right? So like you could have had a really bad, really poor, we'll call it a physical upbringing. And I don't mean the actual physical situation. I mean like physical activity upbringing, right? But also maybe you didn't. Maybe you are an individual that got obese later in life. That can oftentimes also be harder because how fit you used to be, how easy things used to be, and now you're in a position where you're like, oh, I feel like I'm a million miles away from that, and that in and of itself is somewhat demotivating. Like if you go from, like, it happens all the time with people getting injured, like they'll get injured and they're like, oh, I used to be able to do, I don't know, 20 chin-ups, right? And they get injured and now they're like, I can't even do a single chin-up, right? And in their mind, they kind of limit themselves and go, okay, well, I'm actually never going to work on that because I'm so far away from where I used to be. It's not even worth it. I'm injured now. I'm going to always be injured. And there's a whole like mindset shift that occurs, right? And that can often happen if you are an individual that became obese later in life, right? So it's not like one is necessarily better than the other in terms of like someone who has never exercised versus someone who used to exercise and now they're obese. It's difficult for both populations, right? However, the key thing with all of this, before we actually get into some more like practical stuff, the key thing to remember is that like it doesn't have to be resistance training. It doesn't have to be like formal aerobic training. It doesn't have to be like whatever intervention, CrossFit, whatever, right? It doesn't have to be any of those things. You just have to find an activity that you enjoy, that you will be consistent with. That's it, right? So again, it's easy for me to say, oh, our first line of defense should be exercise. Now, again, that's easy for me to say because a lot of people, their idea of exercise is, I have to go to the gym 3, 4, 5 times per week. Like, and that's where it becomes hard in practice. But in reality, it doesn't need to be hard in practice because you have a huge amount of activity that you can pick and choose from, that you are bound to find something that you enjoy. Literally something out there you'll be like, oh, I actually resonate with this. Like it would be very rare if there was absolutely nothing that you enjoyed. Like are you telling me you don't like I don't know, dancing to music? Like you don't like even just shaking your shoulders to music or something? Like there's very few people out there that don't enjoy some form of movement. It's intrinsic to life itself. Like you could move like as an entity, like not you as an entity, as in like evolutionarily, like we could move before we could think. Like it's deeper than that. So if you're always up in your mind, always up in your head, like that's you are missing a fundamental component of life. And that's what Gary goes on about earlier on when he was talking about morality and stuff. Like it is something that you get to, or philosophers have questioned and thought about a lot. But I'm not a philosophizer, neither is Gary. We are just two idiots talking about obesity, right? So what are your thoughts, Gary, in terms of what should someone who is either trying to train themselves and they're obese, or someone who is like maybe a personal trainer, or even like a doctor or something, and they're just trying to help someone engage in better training practices? What are some right now they're like, okay, this is these are important points to think about?
Yeah, so I kind of break these down into three categories because obviously, like what we're trying to do is ultimately similar to anyone else. Like all we're talking about is a difference in fat mass. Still want you to be able to perform resistance training, improve your aerobic fitness, etc. Okay, so the same things apply from a health perspective. But what I break them down into is that there's kind of three broad categories of concerns. One's is body mass itself, the other is body image, and the third is ergonomics, you could say. So, body mass concerns would be, for example, you might have a program that you run in your gym. It's a group fitness program. And as part of that, you might be doing box jumps and burpees, let's say. Okay. So, some sort of circuit. And what you have to realize is if someone is untrained, let's say, and they're 140 kilos and 70 kilos of that is fat mass, like that's non-functional. So it's ultimately very similar to one of your other trainees having a 70 kilo weighted vest on. You know, obviously it's not the exact same because they've lived with that, but there's enough of a similarity there for you to take it seriously. So to expect that individual to perform box jumps and take all of the impact on their joints every time they come down and to move that amount of mass in the first place, the same distance you might expect another client. And then with burpees, you're coming down and throwing all of that mass onto someone's hands, onto their wrists, you know, which are relatively fragile joints, you know, in the grand scheme of things. And then also, you know, putting all that load on them that they have to catch them with their shoulders and their elbows, etc. It's a big ask. Okay, it's a really big ask. It's not the same as someone else who's, let's say, normal weight, or you as a trainer doing that exercise. Even the part of a burpee, let's say, where you're coming back up again, like you have to be able to bring your hands towards your feet, and if there's compression of fat mass between you doing that, again, that's just a challenging thing to do, and it's purely the result of body mass. And I would say the exact same thing almost if that was a 140 kilo bodybuilder, okay? Because bodybuilders don't do that stuff. And they actually know that, you know, really large bodybuilders typically won't be doing things where they're throwing their bodies around like that because they're like, I'm not built for that, you know? And we know bodybuilders ourselves who are up to that kind of range of 140 kilos and they struggle with putting their shoes on. They don't go to concerts because they don't like standing for that long. They have difficult.
That's why they all wear flip flops.
Yeah, they have difficulty in airports with, you know, walking to the terminal and stuff. So this stuff applies even in those quote unquote athletic individuals. So that body mass component is really important to consider. And obviously you could go through every exercise and think about the role it plays. And it's something to think about yourself with regards to your own programs that you're putting together. But another, I think, very obvious one would be walking and running, for example. If let's say you give them a step target of 10,000 steps per day, 10,000 steps per day at 75 kilos lean is very different to 10,000 steps per day at 140 kilos with 70 kilos of fat mass. Again, it's like giving you a big weighted vest and telling you to go and do that. Okay. If someone is going to go and try and do that and they've previously only had 2,000 steps per day, you are increasing risk of things like a flare up of an Achilles tendinopathy, let's say, or the person just being super fatigued and having an awful experience because that's a very intense exercise session for them. And this is something that I always bring up with clients who are untrained generally, not just clients with obesity, is that if I give you, let's say, a 30-minute cardio session, some of the ways I would program that will be 30 minutes at 140 to 160 beats per minute, let's say, okay, as a heart rate range. And if the person has an activity watch, they can easily track that. But if someone is untrained and if they're obese, they might reach that heart rate range walking on the flat, okay? And someone untrained generally, and people with certain illnesses and things, they might reach that on the flat. So that's all I need you to do. That's your moderate intensity exercise in that context. And what you have to realize then as a trainer is that if that is already that person's moderate intensity threshold, you're not going to get them to do an additional, you know, casual walks that are for their steps because we've already established that's their moderate intensity exercise. So there are some of the considerations that you do have to keep in mind that are specific to the body mass itself. So you can think about it as in terms of how does the mass difference interact with this exercise? And then how does the mass affect everyday activities as well. So such as walking, but also other activities of daily living. For example, if someone is if someone has been working a manual job, and they're quite obese, and they've got 70 kilos of extra fat mass, as I said, I know that they've been used to carrying that weight around. So I can interpret from the get-go that, okay, this person has probably developed a level of muscular strength and endurance to deal with the extra mass in the tasks that they're used to doing. So that person's starting point, I would anticipate as being different to the sedentary individual with obesity with the same level of fat mass who has not been doing any activity, because they may not even have the basic adaptations to deal with that fat mass in activities of daily living. And that's particularly the case if someone has gained that weight recently. So for example, someone might have had a 3-year really rough period where they had lots of grief in the family and depression, and they gained loads of weight and their lifestyle went downhill. They became very sedentary. That's a totally different situation to someone who's been obese since childhood and has lived a normal, physically active life. So the same caveats apply ultimately to every client. Where are you starting and where do we need to get to? But just considering that those body mass considerations are important there. Now, will I go on to the other two?
I just,
Or do you want to add? Yeah,
right?
go ahead.
The first thing is like, this is actually a really important thing to understand. First of all, like, well, it's a fun little, point if, people say like, oh, I have a fast metabolism. Like, realistically, individuals that are obese, they have the fastest metabolisms, because everything they do, like, non-exercise activity thermogenesis is a component of metabolism, right? So if this individual literally, I don't know, you play bowling and this other individual plays bowling, you both go to the fucking bowling alley and you both do your fucking whatever 10 pins or whatever it is, 10 rounds, whatever they're called, and you both do that, right? You might go, oh, that was a fine activity. You look at your activity tracking watch, your Apple Watch or whatever, and you go, oh, cool, my heart rate got up to 90 while I was like celebrating getting a strike or something. You're like, great, and you're like, oh, look, I burned, I don't know, well, let's say 200 calories. Just, I'm picking that out of my ass, right? 200 calories. But then you look over at your friend who did the exact same activity as you, but they're 400 pounds, right? Like, they probably burned through 2,000 calories just getting up out of the seat, picking up the bowling ball and throwing it down the lane, Like, so they actually have a faster metabolism, which is just, it kind of throws the way we conceptualize metabolism in the general population, it throws it out the window, because you would hear people say like, oh, you can just stay skinny or whatever because you have a fast metabolism. But in reality, it is the individuals that are heavier that have faster metabolisms inherently, right? But that doesn't mean that they necessarily burn more calories in the day, because like Gary said, like this, they could be very sedentary as a result. Like, most of them obviously are, and this can be, a confounding factor, or, a precipitating factor, I should say, to the obesity. So these individuals are probably not used to a lot of activity. They're probably not used to exercising a lot. So again, their tolerance for activity is lower. So you have to remember that again, like, they're basically carrying around a weight vest, right? So would you say to another individual that, is within a whatever healthy BMI range, but they've never exercised, would you say, right, you know what, we're going to do day one intervention, we're going to slap a 90-kilo weight vest on you and we're going to do box jumps and burpees or whatever? No, you're obviously not, right? However, that's kind of obvious once it's said, but there are some less obvious nuances to that, that are really important to understand if you are going to be programming for yourself or you are programming for other individuals that are obese, right? Like, you might be thinking, like, you are of the opinion that, we're trying to build towards a bench press, right? You're like, that's the gold standard. We're like, we want to get someone to be able to do a bench press, right? And then you go, okay, I'm going to start, I have this progression and regression scheme of like where I start people. I get them, depending on where they are, I get them to do like, push-ups from the knees. And then I get them to do like, full push-ups. And then I get them to do, I don't know, like dumbbell chest press. And then I get them to do, the barbell, right? Like, that might be your normal progression for an individual, which is, perfectly fine progression. You have someone come in, they've never trained, they're in this normal healthy BMI range. That's your normal progression, just getting them used to using those muscles, getting them used to like firing in the right sequence, etc. Right? Basically just learning how to move. That might be fine for that individual. But you have to remember that if you have an individual that comes in, and again, they're 300, 400 pounds, right? Like that push-up from the knees is probably like so much harder. Like the progression regression model is completely backwards for that individual, because they're not like, that's more than them using just purely the bar sitting down on the bench or lying down on the bench. Like that 20-kilo bar is nothing compared to them trying to do a push-up weighing 400 pounds. So it's like that is something that can often get lost, because we as like trainers, we get kind of fixated in these like progression regression models where it's like, oh, these are the exercises that I want you to be able to perform. I want you to be this strong in these exercises before we move on to this next exercise. Now, I'm not saying that like that's generally bad, and again, it gives some variety to the training, and it gives some like, this is how we're actually going to progress the training. But you have to remember that this individual weighs a lot. So your normal like body weight progression, like, oh, we're going to do body weight squats first. I'm like, that individual is squatting 400 pounds now. It's like that can be excruciatingly hard. Like, think of how many people in just the general population that are able to squat 400 pounds. Not that many. So why do you expect this individual on day one in the gym to be able to do that? So that is something just to really keep in mind. And you're probably going to have to come up with different progression models. And for example, just using that squat, like it might be easier for that individual to just sit on a leg press machine and do a leg press that they can actually easily load the weight. They pick the weight that they're actually able for, rather than saying, oh, I'm going to squat 400 pounds today. Like it's just not realistic. And you have to think of those things. And you might have to confront some of your own biases, in terms of, you might think like, oh, we want to focus on like, high return, high yield, like compound exercises, like they burn lots of calories, they use lots of muscle. Why would I have this individual that needs more help, because they have an actual issue going on? Why would I get them to do like, these low yield exercises? I'd rather have them, under the bar from day one, really learning the technique. And it's like, yeah, I can understand the thought process, but you have to remember, again, this individual weighs 300 pounds, 400 pounds, whatever it is. Like the weight factor of just them moving their body is very challenging, and you have to factor that in your progression regression model.
Yes, sir. And then just a kind of a second related point, I guess you could say, is then body image. And this comes back to specific exercises again. So, well, first and foremost, I guess the advice here is obviously different whether we're talking to a trainee or a trainer, because ultimately people have different tolerance for body image concerns. For example, like I remember back when I was like more into bodybuilding, particularly early on, like you wear different things for your upper body day versus your lower body day, for example, because you know that on your upper body day, you're going to have an upper body pump, but when you have a lower body day, all that blood's going to be in your legs and your arms are going to be looking small, and like bodybuilders think about that stuff all the time, and they're very particular about what they wear. Like they're legitimate body image concerns, and similar things obviously apply in the case of obesity. For example, someone might wish to wear more baggy clothes, or they don't want to wear certain tops because when they lie down in a decline bench, for example, their stomach is popping out, or any other position that someone might feel exposed in. That is individual. And as a result, if you're, someone who's getting into the gym and you have obesity, pick clothes that are comfortable for you. Okay, that's the only advice I can actually give someone, because I don't know what you're comfortable with, but for trainers in particular, I think this is important, because, for example, an exercise like a hanging leg raise, let's say, like your t-shirt rides up, it's stuck up and it's really uncomfortable. Or it might be something like if someone's on a spin bike and their knees are coming up real close to their chest, and there's all this, you've got compression of fat mass as a result of that. Or it might be a decline bench press, a sit up, any type of position in which a person might feel like, oh, I'm exposing more of my body than I'm comfortable with at this point in time. Like that mightn't be, a particularly nice experience for someone. So like personally, what I would say in that context, and what I would do if it was me, is I'd actually just ask the person, is there any reason you wouldn't like to do this exercise? Or are there any exercises that we've gone through so far that you don't quite feel comfortable with, or that you haven't felt comfortable with in the past when you've exercised? That's something that's really going to help to build rapport here with someone who might, have had previously, quite poor experiences. So yeah, like body image, it's obviously a personal concern, but that is something that I would be thinking about, and that's something that applies to all of your clients too. Like for example, especially if you're in a commercial gym, there might be certain areas of the gym that are more intimidating. For example, if you go down towards the weightlifting platforms in any gym, there's going to be more grunting. There's going to be people with chalk. It's really intimidating environment, and that's why you'll often see people, edging towards the machines on the other side, the cardio side, because it's less intimidating. So there's simple things that you can do as a trainer then to maybe, bring some dumbbells down that side of the gym so the person gets started there. And that if you bring them down to the weight section, look, we'll just go with a machine so that the person is actually, really comfortable with just doing this because the path is guided first, rather than putting them in the middle of the squat racks with everyone else who's been training for years. And again, that's not specific to obesity. That applies to every client. Okay. In terms of body image, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, there's just a few things as well. Like this is something that if you do regularly exercise, like it can be quite hard to get into the head or the mindset of someone who doesn't. Like things that you don't even think would be of a concern because you're like, oh, I just, this is just what we do. We do this or whatever, and they might actually be quite vulnerable for other individuals. For example, like you might be like, right, we're going to do some sit-ups, right? And you might be like, okay, this is what we're going to do for this individual. Like we want to just work on some ab strength, some core strength, whatever. But you have to factor in that it's probably a little bit of an ordeal for them to get up and down off the ground. Like they don't want people looking at them, struggling to be like, huffing and puffing, kind of like, oh, like I'm struggling to get off the floor, like, and you might not even consider that if you are just someone that's just, I've always trained and like, they just get up and down off the floor. It's no big deal, or like a common one. And you see this all the time. Cause like I did a little like quick search just to see like, how to train the obese trainer just on Google, just to see what, information was being put out. And you see things where it's like, you can tell that these individuals have never actually talked to a human that is obese, right? Because they'll say stuff like, oh, we're just going to have you on a stability ball and doing like crunches. And you're like, this obese individual does not want to be on this ball that's fucking vibrating all over the place, moving side to side, while they already feel vulnerable and then have to do like sit-ups, and it's like their top again is coming off their body, and like they're all like in this really vulnerable position, this real awkward position. Like they're not going to enjoy that. Like it's rare anyone enjoys that. It's like you just enjoy that because again in your head you're like, oh yeah, I can't wait to have my chiseled six-pack on the beach or whatever. It's like this for the average person who's like, scared or like, frustrated with their little like muffin top or something. Like even they don't want to be doing this. Imagine an individual that is more obese, that is more self-conscious of their weight. Like that's not something that they're going to be comfortable with in a general sense. And obviously, again, there's going to be individuals that are like, well, I don't give a fuck, but as a general rule, it's like most people don't want to be in those vulnerable positions. And again, you have to take that into account when you are trying to actually help this individual and not have them leave the session like, I'm never coming back here again because I was put into these, terribly vulnerable positions. That's a bad exercise environment. If that's how I have to train to get results, and I'm going to feel ashamed, I'm going to feel, vulnerable, whatever those feelings are, like if they're thinking then, oh, I have to feel those to get results, like you're pushing them further away. Like you might be a fucking sadomasochist and be like, man, I fucking love killing myself on fucking high rep Bulgarian split squats or something, and you're like, oh, I'm going to do that for my obese individuals because, they need to burn loads of calories. They need to build leg strength, and you have them fucking huffing and puffing away. Their literally blood pressure is through the moon, and they're bright red. They're fucking sweating buckets, everything. Like you might be like, yeah, man, I gave them a phenomenal workout there. But just from like a self-conscious, self-conscious aspect, like they probably aren't going to enjoy that. Forget about the actual effects of like, they wake up the next day and they can fucking hardly walk because you absolutely annihilated them in the gym. Like, forget about that stuff. And because I think most people would be aware that that's not a good idea. But just from the perspective of how do they actually look, how do they actually feel when they are in the training environment, it could literally be like they don't feel comfortable on these treadmills in the gym because they're in a more open area. They'd rather have like the treadmills over here or the cross trainer or whatever it is, like that's kind of tucked away a little bit so they can feel like not everybody in the gym is fucking staring at me. So like stuff like that, you might not even consider it as a trainer, as someone who trains yourself. However, it is a completely normal and valid feeling that obese individuals, what loads of individuals feel when they go to the gym, when they are trying to exercise, like even outside. Like I've trained obese individuals a few times, and even stuff like, oh, we're just going to go for like a longer walk outside, or we're going to start like the process of like walking a little bit faster outside with the goal to kind of be like, we want to get into some running eventually. Like I'm not saying like we start out with this stuff, but even then they're like, oh, like I don't want people to kind of see me exercising like out and about. I don't want them to kind of like be looking at me. And that is something that you have to take on board when you are training these individuals. Like their feelings are completely valid in terms of how secure, how safe, how non-vulnerable they feel doing these exercises.
Yes, sir. And then I guess the additional point I had then was, I guess, ergonomic concerns, which is very much related to the body mass question, but just thinking about how different machines in your gym and pieces of equipment are set up. For example, if you look at some spin bikes, like the seats are absolutely tiny, and if someone, is, quite obese, if they're, let's say, BMI of 40 plus, like a seat that small relative to the size of their gluteal region is just super uncomfortable. It's just not nice, especially when you've got a lot of extra mass on that seat. So that's a concern. For example, the rowing machine is very similar. Like if you look at the seat that's available, it's quite small and sometimes can be quite unstable as well. Decline exercises, as I mentioned previously, when you put someone in a decline, you even feel it yourself, like the blood's rushing to your head and you're kind of like, oh God. And if you think about the effect of fat mass itself, it's also compressing the neck and it's compressing the chest. If someone has a lot of abdominal obesity as well, it's compressing the abdomen. All of that restricts your ability to breathe, because what you have to realize is that your diaphragm, your intercostals, they're all working against all of that additional resistance from the fat mass. So it's like, at jiu-jitsu, for example, when someone has you in side control or mount and they press down in your chest, like it's so hard to breathe. Or anyone will know if someone sits in your chest, it's so uncomfortable. And if you've got a lot of extra fat mass, there's some of that effect going on. So those different types of positions can just be far more uncomfortable. Like similarly, if you're doing ab work, for example, like you mentioned previously, if you're supine, like lying down on your back, again, that totally changes even the breathing during the exercise because of all of the fat mass and the effects on your neck and your chest, etc. So that can be quite uncomfortable for someone. There's obviously plenty of other ergonomic concerns, like for example, a leg press. Some leg press start you in like a really flexed position already, where your knees are like almost at your chest, and obviously if there's a lot of fat mass in the way, that again is just a really awkward exercise to set up. And that's something that's specific to your gym. Like go through the pieces of equipment and think, what do I find really awkward to get into? Like what's just a bit, it's one of those exercises you nearly don't want to do it because it's so uncomfortable to set up. And think about how that might apply for a heavier person. Like even something like a barbell hip thrust, let's say. Most people hate setting up that exercise, but think about like when you set a barbell hip thrust up on a bench that isn't that steady. Like I know it's happened to me a few times where, the bench slips backwards, and the heavier you are, the more likely that is to occur, So go through those exercises and just be practical about what actually makes sense for someone to try and do.
100%. I have nothing to add to that, Gary.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's ultimately depends on what you regularly program for your clients. Like, there's obviously plenty of other specific exercise concerns. Like I think we mentioned previously, or you mentioned body weight exercises, like getting someone to do chin-ups, push-ups, dips, etc. Totally different if you're starting off with extra body mass. So just be practical, and try to put yourself in those shoes, and I've seen people do like an experiment like that before, where a lean person will like wear a simulated suit to see what it's like to carry around the mass as an obese individual. And yeah, it's not an easy feat. Obviously it's not the exact same because they're used to living in it, but yeah, as a trainer, just trying to be empathetic in those cases is really important. I'm not sure there's too much else that's actually specific. What do you think?
Nothing to that, but what I want to do as well is just make sure that people actually have an idea of going away from this going, okay, so this is how we could think about things. Because I don't think our overall training recommendations actually change that much. However, there are some things where I'd be like, if we had an obese individual, this is potentially how I would train them, and I'll just go through some things and you can kind of just chime in with anything that you're like, oh yeah, that's that maybe, or I would do something differently. Because like we didn't talk about this beforehand in terms of like how we would train obese individuals. So I'm sure there's probably some differences, right? Like when I think of it, I'm like, okay, again, we're going to focus on those compound high yield exercises. Well, actually I should just take a step back. When I would be training an obese individual, I would probably again be of the preference for let's get you doing some resistance training. I think it has a multitude of benefits outside of just the act of exercise itself, which as we've said is beneficial overall. My preference would be for them to be doing some resistance training. However, again, keeping that like meta level overview of this, we're going to pick some exercise that this individual enjoys. That's the starting point, right? If they go, I fucking hate resistance training, I probably won't get them to do it, or I will give them the minimum effective dose to be like, right, you don't enjoy this session, but we're doing this because it's going to allow us to really progress XYZ, right? So that's something to keep in mind. But then also we need to keep in mind that like, where is this like individual actually at? Like, do they have an extremely low tolerance for exercise? And if that is the case, like we probably have to really scale things back. And this is where stuff like, like aqua aerobics or something can be really beneficial, right? Where they're like, okay, you can actually take some load off the body, but actually get more movement through the joints, through the fucking, the body in general, right? It just really is awkward and annoying for obese individuals that aqua aerobics also means that you're going to be in the water and that you have to wear, swimsuits and stuff, which, for most people is a little bit of again, that kind of self-confidence, that kind of self-esteem stuff for most people. They're like, oh, I don't want to be in the pool, have people looking at me in my bikini or in my swim trunks or whatever it is. And so if you are an obese individual, those concerns are obviously also really valid. So that is a little bit unfortunate that is the case, that the easier intervention in terms of easier on your joints, etc., is also one that's probably more likely to instill fear, more likely to instill these feelings of like, oh Jesus, I don't want to get in the pool, or I don't want to exercise in general, right? So that's the kind of meta level stuff. But beyond that, like with an individual with obesity, I would be more inclined to suggest, again, resistance training. I would like to see them in 2 to 3 times per week. I think a nice schedule of like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday gives a good effect across the week, right? And what I mean by that is like you're getting the benefits of that resistance training spread throughout the week. It's not all clumped together. And the benefits I'm talking about especially are the, blood glucose regulating stuff, the more like metabolism stuff, the more metabolic stuff, you're getting a nicer spread of that. However, again, if the individual they're like, oh, look, I can only come to the gym on these days and they're all clumped together, that's fine by me, that's obviously the nuance of programming, right? However, with this individual, I probably would be more concerned with like full body training. I wouldn't be doing like some isolated, like here we're doing our push day and we're going to do our pull day and we're going to do our lower body day. Like I just wouldn't be doing that. I would still be focusing on that, compound exercises, high yield exercises, and applying some like appropriate progression, regression, models to those, different exercises and based on where that individual is at. But I probably would be training them full body 3 times per week. I think first of all, I like that for general trainees anyway, but in the individuals that are obese, I'm like, look, we want to just, strengthen the body overall. I think this is just a really handy way to do it if we spread this out across the week, but we also train the full body on each of those days, right? So that's the first thing. I would definitely probably, err on the side of slightly higher reps. And the only reason I say this, like I still think that the general premise of, exercising in the 8 to 30 rep range is a good bet for these individuals. However, from a glycogen depletion perspective, like I'm like, yeah, like we could make a strong case to do higher reps, just from the perspective of like, getting a little bit more glycogen depleted. Now, how much of an overall effect that's going to have, again, it's debatable, but I would probably just use a progression model of like, okay, rather than increasing weights for this individual, we're just going to increase reps over time. So first of all, they're doing a little bit more work. They're burning a little bit more calories, even though I generally don't like to think of resistance training as like a calorie burning event. However, again, like in this individual, I'm like, okay, this actually, we need to get some sort of energy flux going, right? That's probably how I would program the resistance training. In terms of the cardiovascular training, like there is research to suggest that like, higher intensity stuff is more beneficial. However, again, I just look at those studies and I'm like, look, you clearly have never actually talked to obese individuals because they don't want to train like this. And while you could say like, oh, like you got this high intensity interval training, it's really beneficial. Like, again, we have to look at exercise tolerance. Like most people of like normal BMIs have pretty fucking piss poor exercise tolerance for like high intensity interval training anyway. So if you have this individual that hasn't been training like that, it can be quite hard. Again, you could definitely make an argument from a biochemical perspective that there are distinct advantages for that style of training. But in general, I just think it's probably too hard. Like the juice isn't worth the squeeze, so to speak, right? And especially considering that we can get the benefits from other things, other areas. However, look, if you want to go high intensity with the cardio stuff and the individual wants to go for it, by all means do. I would probably still have a phase of like, okay, we're actually going to build up some like aerobic foundation before we just fucking dunk your head under that stuff, right? And again, this goes back to what Gary was saying earlier on in terms of like, call it like ergonomics or just, the individual's body. I would probably focus more on like non-load bearing exercises with this stuff. Like you might think of like, oh, I'm going to do some like cardio, whether it's aerobic stuff, whether it's anaerobic stuff, whether it's fucking whatever. Like you're probably thinking like, oh yeah, I'm just going to use like the assault bike or, whatever. I'm going to go for a run. I'm going to do whatever. Like it's probably not the same thought process you need to have with the obese individual. Like you need to be thinking like, okay, this individual, if they're going to be going like for a run at 300 pounds, like that's a lot of load through the joints repeatedly, so that is something to consider. And then as a result, I'd probably just, recommend using like a bike, using a cross trainer or like a recline bike is, fantastic because again, you can kind of adjust the seat a bit more rather than like I said earlier on, like having that like little tiny seat, really hard to fucking sit on. It's hard for me to sit on, let alone someone that is like 400 pounds, So that's just a concern with the cardio side of things. But yeah, like they're the main kind of things I would be thinking. We could also make a strong argument that we would schedule in some, again, low grade aerobic stuff throughout the workout. Like let's say you have them for an hour, right? They're with you for 3 hours per week. Like you could do 10 minutes of a warm-up on the cross trainer, then get in to do some resistance work, then do 10 minutes of the cross trainer, resistance work, and then again do 10 minutes of the cross trainer, so that you get 30 minutes of total like aerobic work and calorie burning, etc. And you also got your resistance training in, rather than getting them to be like, oh yeah, you have to actually just sit on a treadmill, you do walk on a treadmill for 30 minutes straight through. Like that can be really quite boring for people who enjoy exercise, let alone people that are like, I don't want to fucking be here, so that is something to consider, which is a little bit different than how you would potentially program that for most people. But again, that's just kind of like it depends on the individual. The other thing that I would potentially do as well, which we'll talk about in like the diet side of things in a future podcast, but the other thing that I would do as well is I would probably schedule in some like activity after meals. Like I would be like, right, you're going to eat this meal, you're going to do eat your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, whatever it is. I'd probably be like, right, but after you eat that, like all we want to do is like 5-minute walk or a 10-minute walk, just to first of all, again, bump up that like NEAT, but then also improve like, blood glucose levels, improve like, the handling of those nutrients, etc. And that is actually quite beneficial. Overall, and I would consider that kind of exercise because it's kind of formalized, even though again it is probably just that NEAT, you're just getting your steps in, but that is the majority of the way I would approach training slightly differently. There's the few concerns that I would have.
Nothing to add.
Okay, fine. Well, the final thing I would also say is like there are also some legitimate like contraindications for exercise for some populations, such as again blood pressure issues. Like I'm not going to get someone to be like, we're going to go for a max effort overhead press, when you're like, okay, you've told me you have high blood pressure and you're obese, like we're probably not going to go to these like high blood pressure generating exercises, like the ones where it's like you've got that Valsalva maneuver and you're fucking squeezing hard. Like I probably wouldn't be going for those. Same with the leg press can also be of concern. Like you see people just with non-high blood pressure, they're on the leg press and their face is going fucking purple. So stuff like that, it probably is something to consider. And as I said previously, there are obviously differences between training like an obese youth or someone who has been obese for a longer period of time versus someone who is an obese like OAP, someone that's like older, because again, like we have to think about like frailty, sarcopenia in the elderly, and also like we have to be a little bit more risk averse in those older populations rather than the younger populations. Like again, if you fucking blow out your knee when you're young, like that's not it is a big fucking issue for you, but it's not as big of an issue. Your recovery is probably going to be better rather than if you fucking blow out your knee when you're 70. Like that could literally be the thing that actually kills you overall, especially like something like a hip injury. Like it's like you get fucking immobilized. Now you're 400 pounds, obese, immobilized because you fucking fractured your hip and you have to just lie in bed all day. It's like that could be the fucking nail in the coffin, which is pretty fucking morbid. If you're trying to actually help this individual, where you're like, oh, I was trying to help you, and then actually, no, I was actually the catalyst for your eventual death. So that is something to just keep in mind. And then I just have a few other things, unless you have any other contraindications.
No. And again, like it's hard to even say whether the blood pressure one actually matters. It's just one of those things where like if you want to be super conservative, maybe best. But again, hard to know.
Yeah, like it's just one of those ones where I'm like, look, realistically, like it's goes back to that kind of tolerance thing. If I have someone in day one and it's like they're literally telling me that like, oh, I've had fucking stents in my family, I've had fucking loads of cardiovascular events in my family, I actually have high blood pressure and that's why I'm here, like I'm just not going to risk it then. And again,
particularly if someone gets symptoms, for example, like exertion headaches, like that's something that can be definitely worth avoiding. Things like overhead press, leg press, etc., if the person has clearly reported that they get symptomatic. And I've had that with some clients who are super lean and they're just really prone to exertion headaches on things like leg press, and you just gotta shift the goalposts. It's fine.
Yeah, 100%. And then I'll just have a few things to just say on like barriers to training, although like again, we've done fucking so many episodes on this stuff, so I'm not going to repeat it. And we did talk about this stuff earlier on. The first one is obviously access. Like again, we can talk about the best training protocols in the world in terms of how you actually program your training. It's irrelevant if you actually don't even have access to a gym, so that is something that to consider, especially if you are helping more people or providing more like broad generalized information. Like again, we said earlier on, I would just rather see you do some exercise than get caught up on like what is the best exercise training protocol to get results for an obese individual. Like, you have to consider that access stuff, right? And the next thing then again is obviously like self-esteem, which we touched on. But also on top of that, I just wanted to touch on the fact that, like, if you are training an obese individual or you are an obese individual, like, you have to actually go through a profound mindset shift to actually deal with the issues presented to you. And what I mean by that is, you have to go from like a fixed mindset of like, oh, I am an obese individual. Everything I do is guided by the fact that I am an obese individual. And like, this is kind of like the way I am. I'm stuck like this. You have to move from that to like a growth mindset in terms of like, oh, my actions can actually influence the way like I look, feel, perform, etc. And that's that. If you're already in that growth mindset, like, it's hard to look at someone and be like, how are you in this fixed mindset? However, even people that are, very in like growth mindsets in like their training or, different aspects of their life, like, they probably do have fixed mindsets in other aspects. Like, I couldn't tell you the amount of personal trainers, for example, that are in this really like beneficial growth mindset in terms of their training, their nutrition, etc. But then you ask them about money, you talk to them about money, and they're in this real fixed mindset of like, oh, there just isn't enough money out there, or, oh, I just can't do anything to, change my like monetary situation, etc. Right? So it's like, just because you're in a growth mindset elsewhere doesn't mean that it extends to your entire life. But as an obese individual or training an obese individual, that is something that you have to go through. And it's just, I wish I could give you the keys to that in terms of like, here is how you navigate that situation. But I unfortunately just don't have that. I don't, like, it's something that, again, like, that's the personal training, like the personal side of personal training. Like, it actually is something that you have to coach through, and it's hard to do it yourself. It's hard to do it to other individuals as well. So it just doesn't get easy, right? And then I just want to finally just say, overall, I would just ease into training. Like, you don't need to go balls to the wall from day one. And if you're training an obese individual or you are an obese individual, like, a little goes a long way. And if it's just a case of you doing a slight bit more than you did last week, or than you've ever done, like, that is beneficial, and it will compound. It will result in benefits over time. And you just have to be consistent with it, rather than being in this like all or nothing mindset. Like I said earlier on, like, oh, I would like to have someone do like, 3 training sessions per week, like, that doesn't mean that you have to. If you've done no training sessions per week for the last 5 years, like, 1 training session per week is going to be more beneficial than none. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, Gary, do you have anything final to say? Because I know we have some tasty episodes coming up over the next few weeks to round out this series and then move on to the next series. But in terms of the training side of things, seeing as you are a qualified exercise interventionist, otherwise known as a physiotherapist, and you are a trainee doctor, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think we've added most things. I think in summary, like, exercise ideally would be as accessible to people with obesity as it is for anyone else. There are certainly additional barriers that can be related to body mass, body image, ergonomics, prejudice as well in some cases. I've definitely seen examples where people have laughed at people with obesity in the gym who are clearly making the effort to try and improve themselves, which is pretty disgusting. And I've seen it firsthand. So, like, obviously that helps no one. Like, that just actually, if you like, even if you were to make the case that, right, I'm disgusted by people with obesity, let's just say you hold that position, you actually want them to be in your gym training because you're reducing the probability that you will come in contact with people with obesity who are unfit. So yeah, it's just a pretty useless opinion to hold for anyone, really. But yeah, I think ultimately we've covered everything. I think that, like, the key message really, as is the case with anyone who's starting exercise, is start small and progress accordingly. And I think that if you are someone with obesity, as we said, particularly if you're, at the higher end, like if your BMI is 35, 40, 45 plus, you have to, give yourself some credit for the tasks such as walking and just starting at those low level activities, because for you, you're actually performing a different exercise to me in terms of going out walking. It's a totally different intensity. So if you were to do 10,000 steps a day, that's totally different to me doing 10,000 steps a day. So you have to put that in the category of exercise as opposed to in the category of, activities of daily living, let's say, because that is one of the things that can be a bit confusing for people. Is they might look at workout programs online and they might be thinking, God, if I was to even go through the warm up, I would be in bits. And that's fine because you're at a different starting point, and we have to think about relative intensity. So it's very much similar to, Paddy is a much stronger squat than me. If I tried to do
Longer than you, full stop, Gary.
if I tried to do the weights that Paddy would do for his squat sets, like obviously it would just make no sense. Like, why would I do that? It just makes no sense at all. I'm not going to be able to do it. His warm-up sets would be enough. And that's very similar to, anyone at any level. So much like you put appropriate weight on the bar when you're, weight training, think about putting appropriate weight on the bar metaphorically when you're going for a walk or a run or whatever. Just going out and doing as much as you can is rarely a good option unless you're competing in something. So they'd be my summary points.
And this is really important. Again, it goes back to that, like a little bit is like, it goes a long way. Like it really does, because you could do something you could see online and be like, oh, they say I have to train. Like even I said earlier on, like you train for an hour or whatever, like 10 minutes might be your capacity. Like 10 minutes of that training session might put you on the floor for the rest of the day. You're like, fuck man, like that's the most I've exercised in the last 10 years, and that's okay. Like you start there and you build up slowly. Like that's the whole process of training. Like they call it training for a reason. It's not like you're not competing every single day you go to the gym. I know some people make it out as if they are on social media, like bodybuilders and stuff. They're going to fucking war. But it's training. It's literally training you to get better in future. That's what it is. Just like any other training. You're not going to be fantastic from the start. You build up, you progress over time. Anyway, Gary, I have nothing else to say on the topic. Well, I'm sure we do have else to say. We're just not saying it here. But where can people find us? Where can they find more information about us? What have we got going on? All of that. And then also just give them a quick recap of like, how life is going for you. Because I feel like my life is just incredibly boring. Like I just do a load of work all day, talk to people on like, consultation calls, do my check-ins, do all that stuff. But you actually have stuff going on outside in the real world as well.
My life is basically the same, except that when I'm not doing those triage tasks, I do practice medicine questions. That's about it. So I'm doing online study at the moment, obviously. Well, not obviously, because I actually have been in the hospital a bit, so that was nice. But at the moment, it's mostly online, the odd class here and there. I think I have diabetic foot examination next week and blood glucose testing, because obviously some people don't just do it themselves all the time. No, but I do have some practical classes, but other than that, it's mostly just online learning. Exams are coming up, so we'll be putting the head down a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, college is fine. Business is going well with Triage. The weather is nice, so really can't complain at all. So on that note, we do have coaching spaces available. So, we've got quite a few spaces available each, to be honest, me, Paddy, and Brian. So if you are interested in coaching, you're more than welcome to apply. As I've said to many people who've messaged us asking about coaching and stuff over time, we don't just take on anyone. So it's not like you can just go on our website and click buy, because we want to know that we can do the best job for you and that you're actually a good fit for us too. So one of the things you can do if you're interested in the coaching process is you can drop us an email, info@triagemethod.com, or you can DM any of us on Instagram, or you can go through our website and fill out an application form. And then what we'll do is we'll take you to the next step if we feel that you're a good fit. Because one of the things we've tried to do over time is make sure that we select our clients better, and that if people are in a position where, whether for financial reasons or personal reasons, they would get a better service elsewhere, we'll refer you to someone else. We know plenty of coaches who offer either lower ticket services or services that might be more specialized for your needs. For example, if you're into competitive bodybuilding or something, we know people who are better than us at prepping people for that. So yeah, get in touch if you're interested. We do also have the Coaches Corner, which is for coaches who want to level up their education. So you can subscribe to that if you're interested. We have a weekly newsletter, the Triage Method newsletter, which you can subscribe to. We put out information there that doesn't necessarily get posted on our social media. And you can also just keep up there with, what podcast did we do this week? What other recommended resources do we have? Some testimonials from our clients, etc. So it's a nice way to get like a roundup of what we've been up to. And we are posting on our social media too. So you can follow me, Skinny Gaz. You can follow Paddy, the real Paddy Farrell, and you can follow Brian O'Hengisa on Instagram. And you can follow our Facebook page or join our free Facebook community, the Triage Method community. We obviously have our own Instagram as well, Triage Method, YouTube channel, Triage Method, podcast, Triage Method. So you can find us in all of those places too. I'm not sure there's anything else we do. Do we do anything that I missed?
Probably.
Share the podcast if you like it. That's always appreciated.
Yeah, I have nothing else to say. That was a fantastic podcast. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and we will see you on the next one.
See you soon.